So as you heard, my name is Mark Dalgleish, here from Melbourne, Australia. So it's really great to see such an awesome new conference here in our hometown here. So first of all, big round of applause for the organisers for putting on such a good conference. Yeah, we definitely need the front-end representation here, so that's great. So I'm here today, as you can tell from the lineup, that I'm to talk about designing with components. Now, as many of you may know, I work here at Seek down on St Kilda Road. And among other things, at Seek, I work in the space of design systems as well as front-end shared tooling. And front-end tooling and design systems is something I'm very passionate about. I'm really into the idea of creating platforms on which other people can be even more productive. Bringing that open source ethos into large companies, I think, is a really, really great thing to do. Now, of course, a design systems talk would not be complete without a quote like this. Design systems are all about bridging the divide between design and development. I'm a big believer in this as someone who's very much interested in both sides of this equation. And this is what components really do, I think, and that's why a lot of us are here. It gives us that mechanism to share thought processes across that divide and actually define it in code. Because components let us build our own domain-specific language. The way designers think and operate can be mapped directly into code that actually resembles the way they might have described it in natural language. I think you've seen this play out in the community with things like Shopify's Polaris design system, which is open source, Salesforce's Lightning design system, Carbon from IBM, and of course Seek has its own with Seek Style Guide, which has been out for a number of years now. But if you look at the design process, it still largely starts here, this blank canvas. And this is where the creative freedom comes in, but this is also where the trap is when it comes to design systems, which is how do we go about feeding back into design so that all that hard work that we put into the components that we ship to production actually make their way back into the next round of design. This is a hard problem that a lot of people have been looking at. Luckily, some really smart minds have been hard at work on this problem, notably at Airbnb with their famous React Sketch App project. Some of you may have seen this already. But the idea of React Sketch App is that you can take React code, like you can see there on the left, written in a platform agnostic way, basically. So one way to think of that is if you had to write code for React Native and the web, think of Sketch as just another target, basically. And if you write your code in this way, you can render it into Sketch, as you can see there on the right, really bridging that divide at a technical level and feeding back into design. Now, at Seek, what we found ourselves leaning more towards was another project very much inspired by this called HTML Sketch App. So this is particularly relevant to you if you're not using React, but even if you're using React and not authoring your code in this specific way, HTML Sketch App is kind of the generic solution, which allows you to pull any content out of a browser and export it into Sketch. So in the context of Seek Style Guide, we had a hidden route on our design system website where you could scroll down and see all the components that we have and all their notable states, very much like what you would see in something like a storybook. But the difference here is that each of these are wrapped in a div with a data attribute that describes the name of the symbol as it should appear in Sketch. So annotating the page in this way is what allows the HTML Sketch App CLI tool that we open sourced, if you want to have a look at that. It can work via these hooks. So you run the CLI tool, pointing it at a URL, tell it which directory to write the files to, and it's going to write JSON files to disk as a result. So on the other end of the scale, when you're a designer opening up Sketch, you now have this library generated from the code, and it's completely reflected what was in the last production build. Now, the interesting thing here is because the components are responsive, we can generate automatically a set across all the viewports that we support at a design level, and adding a new one is as easy as updating a piece of config. So here you can see designing a sign-in form in Sketch, and it's very streamlined, very much natural to the designer's workflow. But, and there's a big but here, there's still a problem with this workflow. In fact, I would say there's almost a giant trap in this workflow in that people can fool themselves into thinking that they're using the design system when really they're just using a proxy for it. Because a design tool like Sketch is ultimately still unconstrained, and there's definitely a place for unconstrained design in our processes. But if every design process on every new product feature that we do every day is unconstrained, we have a bit of a problem for ourselves. So we need a new paradigm when it comes to design. We need to design within those constraints when we're further along in the product development lifecycle. And luckily there are a whole suite of tools popping up to solve this exact problem. We need to start designing with components, and not just pictures of components, but the actual running code. So the most notable example of this approach is FramerX. FramerX, as you can see here, it looks and feels like a traditional design tool, but the big notable difference here is that on the left there, what you're looking at is a series of components. And when you drag them onto the document, you can update the props of those. So here you can see that you're operating at a higher level than these traditional illustration tools. But all those components, in the case of FramerX, are actually React components written in TypeScript. You can open them up, edit the source, you can create new ones, and you can publish to a shared store. You can have a shared set of components across your team and really start to bridge that divide between development tools but also the design tools as well. FramerX is definitely not the only one. There's also Module Studio, which is still in active development, very much following the same approach. This one's slightly more constrained with a document layout structure. Interplay is another notable one, which one of the developers is actually here in Australia, in Sydney. Seek has had a bit of a play around with this one, as you can see here. And again, bringing all the work that we put into our components that run in production are now running into the design tool as well. What I love about these is that they're blurring the lines between design and code and really trying to bring these two different mediums together and making it a single medium that we share together. But what I want to pose to you today is this question of what makes these design tools and what can we learn from them. So to me, what really makes them design tools is that they're easy to set up. You can just install a new application, it's very easy. New documents are cheap, so if you want to try something new, it's very easy to spin up a new document. Once you're in that new document, iteration is really fast. Design is all about trying new things and iterating to the ideal solution, and these tools are built for that. And once you're ready to share your work with others, it's very easy to share it, particularly with the web-based solutions where it could be as easy as sending someone a link. All of these things together, I think, are key to getting people to try new things and to iterate quickly and to share their work. Whereas with code, we can get very bogged down in implementing the one ideal solution that we've decided on. But I think these tools are still working under the same assumptions, even though they're bringing components into the fray. Some of these assumptions have been around for a long time. These assumptions that code is slow, that code is difficult to set up, and that code requires specialist knowledge in all cases. But I'm not sure that this is true anymore. I think our industry has come a long way since the current set of tooling built on top of these assumptions has really gained traction. So you look at something like JSBin. This has been around for a long time. It's a very basic example. But if you want to get someone started playing around with JavaScript, this is one of the best ways to do it. They don't have to install any special tooling. They just go to a website, and there they can start typing code and running it. If you want to get someone that you know started with coding, one of these tools is a really great way to do it. Similarly, there's RunKit, which is in a very similar vein. But what's interesting about RunKit is it integrates with NPM. So you can have any NPM package you want, and this is actually integrated into, with a link to this from every package on NPM. So if someone wants to try out a package, I find myself using this quite regularly if there's a brand new package I want to try. Other similar examples I've seen around the web, for example, is the Babel REPL. So if you want to figure out what's going on under the hood when it comes to JSX, for example, and see what does that transpile into, you can write code there on the left and see what comes out on the other side. Tools like these are a really great way to teach people how these tools work and how it's really not as magical as it might seem on the surface. But again, with very little setup, no overhead, just go to a URL. TypeScript is a really great example of this as someone who's in the last year or so really got on board the TypeScript train. This tool is a great way to get people started playing around with it and starting to get a feel for what something like TypeScript can provide. So you can write TypeScript there on the left, see what it compiles to, and for a seasoned JavaScript vet, it's great to see on the other side that the code comes out basically the same, but you get really good insights into the types of the code you're writing. CodePen is another really good example where it's really all about the design and there's a really great community around it. So beyond, of course, providing the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript panes for you to play around with optional preprocessors, what's exciting about CodePen is the fact that there's a whole community there where you can sign in and share your work, and it's very creative, right? And again, this is one of those outlets for people who maybe are new to coding, but this gives them a way to get started very easily and share their work with others. If you want to go to the extreme end of what can be done in this sort of environment, Code Sandbox is a really amazing thing to look at. It's basically a full development environment in your browser. So what you're looking at there on the left is your typical file browser, including a package JSON where you can put your dependencies. You can create new files. You can write code as you normally would and import files from the import modules that you've just created on the fly. And then on the right there, what you can see is the application actually running in a browser. And you're free to resize that pane, pop it out into a new window. If you want to get someone started with the more serious end of developing web applications, something like this can actually get them in feeling like what we feel like every day, with basically zero setup in their machine. And this has become integral for a lot of open source packages to share shareable links of what a project would look like. So in this case, I'm looking at a starter kit for React Native for web. This stuff's invaluable if you're trying to get people understanding the inner workings of these sorts of projects. Now you look at all of these, and even though they're tools by developers for developers, they're still very much following these sorts of guidelines of trying to be easy to set up, making it easy to create new things and iterate on them and share them with people when you're finished. And I think these are things that we really need to feed back into a lot of different areas that we work on. So in my case, what I'm trying to talk about today is how this is relevant to the world of design systems. So with design systems, we have the advantage of having components. We have the ability to define that domain-specific language and create that language that's shared between the different disciplines. And in the case of React, what we're using at Seek, we have a language like JSX, which is actually quite simple in terms of the syntax that you need to learn. And once you're past that initial speed bump of the JSX syntax rules, which luckily are not that complicated, you then find yourself having to focus on learning your design language. Those components are really the key to bringing design and development together, and getting people to work with those components and share them is the secret to bringing down this divide between these two worlds. And ideally what we're going to do is solve this problem. We want to make it so that it's fast, easy to set up, and hopefully doesn't require specialist knowledge. In the case of design, there's been a lot of tension in the past of designers being expected to learn how to code, and that's going to be a hurdle for us if we want to move forward in this space. We need to show people that not all coding is alike, and something as simple as JSX is maybe approachable for people who have tried coding in the past and let it fall away, or maybe haven't even tried coding before at all. So what this culminated in at Seek was the creation of this tool called Playroom. This is what I want to share with you today. So this is our style guide website. Now, it's very much your standard style guide website. Let me make sure I'm on the internet. So as you click through, you can see the different components in the different states, as you would expect. But the important thing is that there's a link here to our Playroom. So again, in the same vein as these other tools that we saw before, you don't have to install anything onto your machine. You don't have to have Visual Studio Code set up or NPM. You don't have to install any packages. You just click a link and you've got immediate access to it. So when you click your link, click that link, this is the Playroom as set up with Seek Style Guide. So this is deployed as part of our build process. So every time we build the component library and deploy it to NPM, we also publish the website, and part of publishing the website is publishing this Playroom with the latest of all the components that we've created. So what I'm going to do is create the hello world of a component layout, which is, for me, which is the sign-in form. So at the bottom here, I can write code. Now, the catch here is that I'm just going to write JSX. I'm not writing a component. I'm not writing a function that returns JSX. I'm just writing the raw JSX. Behind the scenes, we wrap that in the required code to make that valid. And if you have multiple nodes, we wrap it in a fragment to ensure that also is valid. So that means that I can just start typing. So if I create that open angle bracket, you'll see it's already suggesting the available components to me. I'm going to add a header to the page. And as easily as that, we have the Seek header on the page, and it's responsive. So we've configured it with the viewport sizes that we want to target during our design flow here. And it's fully interactive, of course. So I can click here and expand the mobile layout. Typically, in a real application, you would be signed in. So I can actually start to play around with the props here. So I can say that the authentication status is one of these three. I'll say that I'm authenticated. And I'll say that my username is Mark. And that's now updated with my name. And when I open that panel there, you'll see that I'm seeing what a user would see when they're signed in. Now to round out that full experience of a shell of a page, I'm going to also add, as you might expect, the footer to the bottom of the page. So now we have the beginnings of a Seek page. I can start to put content in the middle. I'm going to add a section, which is our white space container. And inside of that, I'm going to add a text node of type hero, and let's say sign in. Now, as I type, there's a little bit of debouncing, but more or less, as I type, it's updating live in the browser across all the viewport sizes. Now, the next step I might do here is add a card to the page. And inside that card, I'm going to, again, add our white space container of a section. And I'm going to add a text field, which I'll update shortly. But one thing that's really cool about this flow is that if I hit Command S, I actually get prettier formatting live in the browser as well, so you can clean up as you go. Now that text field, what I'm going to do is add a label to it. We'll say email address. Now the astute of you might be noticing already that this layout doesn't look really that good at 740 wide. That text field's pretty wide. This is the point at which you'd already start reaching for more higher level layout components. Let's just pretend I didn't have any of those for a second and say that I might need to reach for a hack, right? So I'm going to add a style attribute to this card, and I can say that the max width is, let's say, 500. Now this is the point at which if I was pairing design and dev trying to figure out a design for this page, this is something that you'd be jotting down and saying, why do I have to reach for an inline style? The ideal, to me, of a design system is that you shouldn't have to think about CSS, let alone write it. So this is already a bad sign for our design system. But this is something that might be missed in a traditional design tool like Sketch. That thing would just get glossed right over. But here we found that hole in the design system right away. But if we continue on, we've got our hack in place. We've made a note of it. We're going to add some more fields to the page. So we're going to add a password field. Now because this is live, of course, I can actually make this a real password field by saying type password. And now when I type in the field, of course, that one's visible and this one is hidden. Because we're using React and it's re-rendering, it's actually maintaining the state, so I can actually leave that state there in the document and start adding more things. I'm going to add a checkbox here, and we'll say that the label is remember me, and let's just say that it's checked. Get that tick in there. So we're getting close to the end of our basic sign-in form. What we're going to do, of course, is add the actions to the end of it. So we've got our button group, and inside of that we're going to add our button. Inside the button we'll say sign in, and I'm going to customize the color of this. So we'll say color equals, and we've got our choice here, we'll say pink. And one more, we'll add a cancel to it. But this one we'll say is transparent. Now this is obviously a very basic layout, but you can see how very quickly in front of a crowd, so nervously typing away, I was still able to throw together a basic sign-in form. Now the idea of a design system is that you can do things a lot more complicated than this, of course, but this gives you that environment for you to really get that feedback loop happening between what's in the design system, what I want on the screen, and how easily I can connect those two. Now, possibly the best feature that you can't really see at the moment because I'm full screen is that the entire time that I was working on that UI, the URL was updating. So the URL actually has a base64 encoded version of the code in that pane at the bottom. So I'm free to grab that, copy it, and Slack that to someone, and then they would click the link, and as easily as that, they see the design that I've created. Naturally, because it's editable, they can come in here and they can play around with it, make some changes, send the URL back. And this actually becomes a really vital workflow once you start distributing your work between the people working on the design system and people working in the teams. They can now start to share that work across those boundaries. All right. So we've open sourced this, and I've greatly encouraged you to check it out. So it's available on NPM as Playroom. So if you install this, it's a CLI tool. A lot of cameras came up, so I'm just going to pause. Yep, that's enough. So as I said, it's a CLI tool. You can run Playroom start to give you the local development environment, which is really important if you're developing your component library and you want to get that consumer feel. That's how I use it regularly. But also Playroom build, which will generate a website for you that you're free to deploy anywhere. So the obvious use case being what you've seen here, which is making it part of the documentation for your design system. Now, as with any good JavaScript tool, it has its own config file. What you need to do is tell it how to find your components. It also supports themes, which I'll cover shortly. You're able to customize the component that wraps each frame, which is particularly important if you need to set up anything on context or the theming, for example. You can customize the widths, so the sorts of screen sizes that you target are fully able to be configured. And being a Webpack tool, you can also get under the hood and customize the Webpack config as well. So all these things together mean that you can really start to take those components you build and release them in a form ready for people to actually experiment with them with zero setup. So I mentioned themes. What about themes? Where does this come in? So I've talked about Seek Style Guide, but honestly, Seek Style Guide is actually something that we're actively deprecating at the moment. The last talk was talking about big migration tasks. This is one we're going through at the moment, is getting people off Seek Style Guide and onto Braid. That's a big story there, but the short of it is that, as many of you may already know, but I certainly didn't until I worked at Seek, Seek is actually the Seek group of companies. And one thing that we're trying to do is start to build more to share across the different companies within the group. And a key enabler of that at the UI level is a design system that's themable, and that's what Braid offers for us. So this is actually a really good story for the need for something like Playroom and designing in code. So this is what the Braid website looks like. Again, very much your standard design system site with all the components in their various states with code snippets and so on. But again, there's that Playroom link. Now, the difference here is that we don't just have the different screen sizes, but we also have the different themes available. And in our case, those themes can be quite different. They're not just simple palette swaps of brand colors. It's actually swapping out the underlying grid system and the typography and the fonts. Because we're actually having to support brands that were sort of pre-existing before we went down this road. Hopefully one day these will be aligned, but this is a good example of how those differences make it really hard to design in a traditional way. We really need to see what a layout looks like across those different themes in a way that actually matches what a user will see. If you're working within a tool like Sketch, building something like this would be pretty much impossible. The odds of you even getting it correct are near zero, and the odds of a developer building it accurately are near zero as well. So for us, design systems aren't just a nice to have to do something like this. They're actually very much a requirement. And what Playroom does is it lets us actually work within that medium itself and see what the theming looks like and make that theming system part of the design process as we evolve the UI. Now, what I found interesting is that, I find sometimes the best tools are the tools that after you build them, you find that you use them for other things that you didn't really foresee. So our workflow has actually been augmented quite heavily around this tool, again, in ways that I didn't expect going in. So the first thing is in our day-to-day development workflow, and I say this as someone who works on the design system itself. So typically people, I think, work in something like Storybook, and we still use that sort of tooling. But there's another angle that I think can be missed, which is what it feels like for a consumer to play around with the components, right? To do unexpected things, to try adding and removing components, to try updating props. And this has actually become the best environment for us to do that as developers on the system. So this is actually a very common sight in our team area, is to see someone, of course, in a real scenario, this would be across multiple monitors, but having a code editor open in one window, a browser window open in the other to Playroom. Of course, Playroom has its own editor built in, so there's these two angles that you're working on simultaneously. You're looking at the source code of the system itself and trying to make that have new abilities or fixing bugs or making improvements. But then simultaneously what you're doing is simulating what an end user's experience is to develop with those components. And there's no better way to know what that's like than to just have an editor that you can play around with. Add to that the fact that we have to support theming, and this became something that we just have to work in this environment. So this has been a really interesting learning experience for us in how we can be better as design system developers, getting into the headspace of our end users. The other thing that's been really exciting to see is how it's augmented our pull request workflow, and this actually proved to be a really, really big benefit of this approach. So we're big on pull requests, before going into master. Here's an example of a PR that was opened. Now, what's great is that we actually deploy a preview version of the website on every PR, so it's easy to open it up and have a look. But the Playroom is actually part of our website. So that means that when someone proposes a change to the design system, in a couple of clicks, I can actually open up an editor where I can start playing around with the proposed changes to the design system live in the browser, getting a feel for what are the APIs like, are they expected, does it compose well with other components. I can even do things like push the boundaries and find bugs. Now in this case, luckily the developer who's in this room, Michael Taranto, did a really nice thing, which was add a Playroom link for us. So rather than letting us guess at what a good use case of this might be, he's given us a bit of a starting point. So this is a really good example of how our development workflow has really been improved by trying to think more like a designer, in the sense that we're trying to look at it from the end user's perspective and look at those APIs and how well they play in a real world environment. The other thing that's somewhat more recent for us is how it's been augmenting our support workflow. So one thing that we've introduced relatively recently as we've moved further and further into the design workflow is this Braid Design Support Slack channel. This has been a really exciting development for us, which is starting to say that even though we're a team of developers primarily, we're on the ground ready to help in the design workflow. So as designers start to work with Braid and they have to face the realities of working in different themes particularly, having a mechanism for them to reach out and ask questions during the design workflow, long before it's a card on a wall somewhere that it's expected to be built immediately, more or less, we can get in earlier in the process and work with the designers. And so what we found is that ability to share links has been key to getting into that process. So designers will show us a design and say, I'm trying to make this work in Braid. And what we can do as a support team is open up Playroom and start to try and recreate that design in code. And when we think we've got it close enough, we can just shoot them a link straight away in Slack and say, what do you think about this? Or equally, we can show them the shortcomings in the system that we have today and maybe some proposed alternatives, or maybe raise some ideas for workarounds for the development team. And this has been really successful for us. It's still relatively early, but having that ability to have the design system ready in a browser for us to play around with and share with anyone via Slack has been huge. So what we've got now is this sandbox for our design language, and it's something that now that we have it, we don't know how we could have worked without it. It's really vital to us as a design system team. Now, one thing I want to make clear, and this is particularly important as we start trying to get this message out to the people we work with, especially those non-developers, is that this doesn't eliminate traditional design tools. It's not my life's goal to make it so that people never open Sketch, right? There is a place for that. I think it just reframes their purpose, and I think we have to be very careful about what problem we're trying to solve and at what stage we are in the product design life cycle. So this sort of thing makes perfect sense for your everyday design workflow, that if you're starting up a new product feature, you really want to think at that high level from a user's perspective. What problems are they trying to solve, and how best can we arrange our product to suit those needs? And I completely understand and agree that you don't want to be too bogged down in the implementation details of the code at this point. So we don't want people rushing into Playroom immediately at this point. That's definitely not the idea. But equally, if what you're wanting to iterate on is the nitty-gritty details of your design system, this is where you should be operating. It's about designing that palette that all products draw from. A new product feature shouldn't accidentally invent a new type of button, ideally. That's a separate decision to be made. In the meantime, you can choose to use something that's already in the palette, and a tool like Playroom helps drive you towards that pre-existing palette. But the big message I'm driving and trying to make it happen day to day and getting some progress is this idea that high fidelity iteration should be in code. And that's ultimately what a design system is for, in my mind. It's about making this a possibility. But then the responsibility lands on us as people building these components, in that your design language should make this possible. The components should read in a way that non-developers can actually make sense of them. A phrase I often use as we're developing is that this component sounds too devy. It sounds too much like what a developer would say. We really need to make sure that our code reads the way a designer would speak about the problem space. The closer we can get to the way designers think in the way our code operates, the more that this future becomes a possibility. So we need to make this happen. So we're seeing the rise of code-powered design tools in the era of things like FramerX and Interplay. But what I'm really interested to see, and the people in this room can help actually make this happen is this idea of design-powered development tools. We as developers need to get better at design and understanding designers and making our tools actually work within the design process. That divide between design and dev is as much our fault as it is designers, and we need to do our part to break down that divide. So if we pull this off, if we get our components right and we get the tooling around those components so that we can iterate quickly, I think we can deliver on this promise of design in the final medium, designing in code, designing in the browser. But it's going to take work for us to get there, and it's going to take a rethink. And hopefully you'll join me on this journey, because I feel like we're just getting started. As I said, Playroom is open source, so if you're working with components today, it is for React, so if you don't work with React, please rip it off and build the Vue version or the Angular version, please do. I'd love to hear about it. So yeah, if you're operating in this space, please do check it out, give it a spin, see what you think and let me know, and hopefully, as I said, we can make this future a reality. That's it for me today. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Well timed. Oh.
I'm curious how you still use Storybook.js, just like how do you separate the concerns between Playroom and Storybook?
Yeah, so we still use Playroom. Actually, Storybook. We primarily use it as a testing tool. We actually have screenshot tests hooked up to Storybook via Chromatic. So that tends to be more for static examples of saying, you know, here's a button in its various states, and then we'll use that as a basis for screenshot testing. And there's very much a good use case for that, obviously. Playroom's trying to solve, I guess, a different problem, which is what does it feel like to have a blank canvas in front of me and then to iterate up to a finished UI? So Storybook doesn't give you that. So I don't see them as sort of competing ideas. They're just trying to solve different problems. Yeah.
I will get up
there. How long did it take you to have the component library working, and what was the size of the team working on Braid and this?
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people, it started as just like a side thing somewhere. Like no one came to us and said, we need you to build this, we've created a team for you. It started, our first React project, once we started working with components, it became obvious that this is something we could do. And like I said, I think that's why you're seeing such a rise in design systems, is React just naturally lends itself to this way of working. And I think what you find, like again, probably like a lot of people go through, is that as you start to build up that pool of components, people start to want to reuse them and then depend on them. And very quickly, we found ourselves in a situation where it was delivering all this value, but no one actually owned it. And so we made a case to the business that we should at least have one person looking after it. So we had that for a while. That was for maybe a year or so. But then when the requirement for theming came along, to me it became really obvious that one person is not much, but it's definitely not enough if you're trying to do something of that scale. So now we're actually only at 3 people on the team full-time. We also have a designer who's full-time on design systems, but not strictly on Braid. But I don't know, I'm very much of the opinion that like small teams are better if you can get away with it. So I actually don't mind a team size of 3, even though it can be a bit hard sometimes. Yeah, I think Braid's come together in the last year or so, and it's really starting to ramp up now. But I think that support channel that I talked about and getting that feedback loop with consumers has been one of the biggest things to help us ramp up. So that's sort of where we are at the moment.
Hi. Just a quick question on the theming aspect. How do you go about automation testing the themes and the components to make sure that no one breaks someone else's theme when they change a component?
Yeah, that's a great question. I sort of touched on it before with the Storybook question. So if you've worked with Storybook, you know that it's all about setting up all these different examples, and you'll say, here's the component in all of its notable states. As part of our Storybook setup, we also automate the process of creating a set for each theme. So there's no work involved. We have our own format, which is just a JS file that exports an array of examples. and then we just iterate over that array for and spit one out for each theme. And so then we use Chromatic, which is a screenshot testing tool on top of Storybook. And so what they do is they open up the Storybook and take a screenshot of all the examples, and they do a diff against master. And so every single pull request, this has been one of the best things for us to have in our tool chain, is the ability to see on a given pull request that you get, it's very reassuring to make a big refactor and still get that green tick of like nothing has changed in the screenshots across all themes. And equally, if you make a targeted change and you know exactly what you're doing, it's very reassuring to see that, yes, only what I changed is actually changed. But the flip side, of course, is, as you would expect, sometimes you get the opposite, which is you think you've changed this one thing and like 80 component screenshots just changed. And so that's definitely saved us a lot. So I would say, apart from, I'm pitching Playroom a lot here, but if you haven't looked at component level screenshot testing, I'd say it's one of the best things that we've invested in, so definitely check that out.
Well, while I walk over, one of the things that Playroom has me really excited about is the prospect of being able to have a design jam and be like, is this what you wanted?
Yeah.
Is this, and like just to get around that overhead of developing it after like a rich design and finding out it doesn't work.
Yeah. I'll just quickly add to that too. Like one of the ways I've pitched the tool and its earliest uses was as a tool for pairing between design and dev. It's like the best tool if you've got a designer and a dev at a laptop. It gives them that playground that they don't have to sit around waiting for your dev environment to be ready. It's just ready to go.
Yeah. So I'm really curious about Playroom. Like, has there ever been a requirement at one point when you're designing the system to actually have the ability to adjust the height as well? So like, let's say like I got a lot of these clients suddenly want like, all their stuff working like really old phone, like with really short height, and then because of the height, you cannot see the CTA buttons and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so you can, in the config, it's only the widths because it just scales to fit. You can resize the code pane. So that's a cheap way to make the iframe the size you want. Of course, the browser window can be resized as well. But yeah, you can't actually configure the height currently. But yeah, you can do it.
We should group everyone together with questions. Where were you? Got dubbed in.
Hi, so the question I want to ask is, usually when you build a React app, like if you're a dev, you kind of bundle component into what you think is correct. But from what I'm seeing, you kind of, each of the component is something that you can reuse everywhere in the system. So I understand that SIG is a company that you build for a product. You don't build the component design system. So at what point do you decide that, okay, we need to fall a bit back, we need to rebuild like all the reusable components so the Playroom can take advantage of that?
So I'm not sure if I understood the question. How do we know that it's actually working in practice, and what's our...
No, because it's like saying, in my case, right, if I have a navigator, I will bundle every single button text into one navigator. But in your case, you will have, okay, this button, let's split it into another component, this text, let's split it into another component. So at what point that you know that, okay, let's not bundle everything together and then split them?
Oh, so yeah, if I understand the question, one of the things that Playroom does I didn't call out is that it automatically just imports everything in the system for you, so you don't have to write any import statements. That's not at all what happens in the production setting. So we have like ES module support where we only bundle exactly the components you use. Yeah.
All right, I think that's about it for the questions. But once again, thanks so much.
Thank you.